We've been talking about sustainable resources like food and energy and water, and now we need to bring these things together. And we bring them together geographically and talk about where people live. So today I'm going to talk with you about sustainable cities. What do I mean by cities? What are the technical challenges to sustainability in cities? And there are a lot of them. The use of land and materials for building, transportation to get people around the city and in contact with each other, energy, water, waste, air quality. The economy of the city is part of its sustainability. You could have a lot of other things, but if there's no employment, it's a little hard to argue that the city is sustainable. Cultural, educational, recreational, health and entertainment institutions. It's not just physical. It's also attraction. New York City right now is the place that undergraduates in America want to study. Why? Is it because they love NYU and Columbia and Fordham and all the rest and CUNY? No. Is it because they all saw Friends when they were growing up and they all want to be Jerry Seinfeld? Maybe. Judging by the number of people standing outside of Tom's restaurant taking photos for a show that hasn't been on the air in a decade, it's pretty interesting. My brother's a professor at NYU, and his biggest complaint is the number of tour buses that go through the village on a regular basis and crowd the small streets down there. So these other factors, these intangibles of culture and entertainment are incredibly important. Then, of course, there are the financial challenges. We have to pay for these things. The organizational and management challenges, we have to figure out a way for our organizations to work on this. And then, of course, the public policies that will encourage it. So let me start with the definition. What's a city? Well, first, a city is a place that's not designed to be in harmony with natural ecosystems, but it's a place dominated by human activities. There's the city, the concept of the city is actually to bring people together and, in a sense, keep nature out. That's why we built cities in the first place, to keep nature out. So it's a kind of interesting concept when you think about sustainability. So what do I mean by sustainability when I think about cities? Well, first, a city that uses as few non-renewable resources as possible and then has the least possible damaging impact on the rest of the environment. In other words, part of the question here is how do you bring all these people together without destroying the planet, by minimizing the impact on the planet. Now, every society defines its metropolitan urban areas in different ways, but it's always about population. In the United States, we say that an urban area with 50,000 or more in population, or an area with 50,000 or more in population is an urban area. But think about what that means, okay? I mean, what it really means is in the United States, Phoenix is a city, right? Anybody here from Phoenix? Okay, so that's a city, and New York is a city. Now, these are very different places. In the physical geography of the cities are different. Their relationship to their surrounding ecosystems is different. And yet they're all cities by the way we're defining them. There are now over 3.7 billion people living in the world's urban areas. And urban areas can vary from very small towns, like White Plains or Jersey City or Trenton, these are fairly small places, to megacities, places like Bogota or Mexico City or Tokyo or Hong Kong. You go to a place like Hong Kong, and the scale of it is even impressive to somebody who's from New York. You know, I'm used to seeing 6 apartment buildings together in a development, each of them going 30 stories high. There's 16, and they're all going 70 stories high. It's the scale of those cities is almost dwarfing the cities that we're used to. Cities are concentration of humans and their activities. Now, what does the concentration do? It provides both opportunities for cost-effective infrastructure and problems due to the impact of these concentrations of people on the planet. Now, the alternative, if you were to spread everybody out among the planet, that has other impacts. Now, we tried that here in America. We called it New Jersey. We actually called it suburban sprawl. The places in New Jersey that were in the countryside, or the places in Long Island that used to be potato farms, are now considered by census definitions part of cities. I mean, we think of them as suburbs, but they're really cities. They have sewer systems and electrical utilities and all of the things that cities have, including taxes and school systems and all these other municipal services. They are cities. We have to be thinking now about what kind of geographic layout creates the most sustainable type of city. Now, sprawl, which was how we got started on a lot of our expansion in America of urban areas, creates its own problems. Non-point sources of pollution, meaning pollution that doesn't come from a pipe, but pollution that comes from runoff from roads and from gardens and from farms, is one of the problems. Ecosystem destruction as well. Inefficient infrastructure. When you have those lower densities, it's more expensive. You got to run that sewer line another 30 yards, but there's only 4 people at the end of it. That is expensive because there's fewer shared resources. I mean, the general design of New York City is very energy efficient because, as Paul Simon said in his song, you know, one man's ceiling is another man's floor. When you live in an apartment, you have less heat escape, less air conditioning problems, less exterior walls, and less physical space. We live in this city on much less space per person than people do in Phoenix or in Tucson or in Los Angeles. We're used to smaller places. And part of it is because we actually spend less time in those places because we spend more time in public spaces. It's part of what attracts people to New York City. It's part of why all these kids want to go to college here, because they don't want to stay home and watch the big screen TV with the family all night long, every night, night after night after night. You know, they want to go out and do something, you know, believe it or not. So there's that. Much of the U.S.'s projected population growth for the 21st century, though, could be accommodated by going back to the old cities. If you go to, anybody here been to Newark recently? There are open fields in Newark, New Jersey right now. Okay, there are opportunities for real estate development in downtown Newark you can't find anywhere else in New Jersey, you know, except in lands that you're not allowed to build on because they're ecologically fragile. And it's sitting on top of all that urban infrastructure. It's already there, okay? So and that's true in Detroit, and that's true in Cleveland, and that's true all over the place. And so that's an advantage the United States has. China doesn't have that, and Africa doesn't have that. They're going to have to build new cities in those places. Now, that has some advantages, actually, if they build them correctly. But in much of the world, new cities and settlements are going to have to be built. So there's a need to develop all of these with the least possible environmental impact. And that requires a great care in designing human settlement, where we reduce the flow of resources in and pollution out. That's really what has to happen. And that is a design question. We actually can do more development, more population density in some cases than we have, with lower impacts if we manage it correctly. Now, one of the classic works in this, which I didn't ask you to read for this course, but which you might want to read, was written in 1969 by a fellow named Ian McHarg. He wrote a book called Design with Nature. And it was one of the more influential books of its time in thinking about urban sprawl, suburban sprawl. Actually, that book and Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities were two of the most important books, I think, that have ever been written in terms of understanding how to make sustainable cities. Jacobs argued against large-scale mega projects and understood the fabric of cities and the street life and how important it was. And McHarg actually paid a lot of attention to drainage, one of the things that he said, which you see reflected in what's called cluster development, is if you take a piece of property, instead of subdividing it and putting 100 houses on 1 acre plots, if you put the 100 houses on 5 acres and save the other 95 acres as open space, you can create common space for all the people living in those 5 acres, and in fact increase their quality of life and maintain the ecosystems at the same time. And he discovered something that's pretty interesting that I don't think everybody understood. Everybody likes that acre around them for psychological purposes, but they actually did studies and showed that 90% of the utilization of the acreage was in the part right adjacent to the house called the patio. That most people's outdoor access in their suburban homes does not take place on the borderline of their property, but in fact takes place right next to the house. And that in fact that if you develop these houses with enough soundproofing and enough privacy and so forth, they would be very popular. And they are. They've worked, although people still, at the same time, following his work, you also see the development of cluster housing and the mega mansion. Okay, you see people building these 5, 6, 7, 8,000 square feet homes. And again, nobody lives in 5, 6, 7, 8,000 square feet. Even Derek Jeter. You don't need that much space, no matter how, and you could have a family of 40. You probably don't need that much space, and most people are there by themselves with their 1 or 2 kids. And so do you really need your own bowling alley and your own home theater and 6-car garage? Somebody does. Okay. Well, so there are some people who think this is an essential for their quality of life, but I'm skeptical about it. But by concentrating human settlements and by managing our waste flows and where the water runs off of our settlements, we can probably accommodate the other 3 million people we're going to get, 3 billion people we're going to get before the population of the planet stabilizes. Well-designed land use can reduce stress on ecological systems by managing where you put people. You don't put people on the marshes in the most fragile environments. You don't drain them to build subdivisions. You find the highlands. You put the buildings there. You put the buildings in places where they will minimize impact, and you build drainage around it to collect the human impact so that they don't destroy the local ecosystems. And you try to think about what's our ecological footprint as we build. So this is, of course, what you need to do, but to do this, the free market in land use and sales has to be regulated, because otherwise, there are a lot of people that need the bowling alley and the private viewing screen and the bar and the cappuccino cart that's only for them and all the rest of that, whatever it is that they seem to need all this space in. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing if you think about how people live. I mean, it's not to say people want a 200 square foot efficiency. There is certainly a certain amount of physical space people need. But the average home in the United States, it keeps going larger and larger and larger. That's changed recently because of the recession. But before the recession, it was just going up and up and up. And, that's all space you've got to heat or air condition. It's all space you've got to, that is not really necessary for many people's quality of life. And in any event, in a planet with 10 billion people, we have to think about the resources that we use. Land use and materials is a challenge. A lot of builders and architects are paying serious attention to the sustainability of their building systems and materials, and we're seeing more and more attention being paid to that. In our own master's program, we have a course in that. Architects in the architecture school here are paying more and more attention to these issues of building materials. And I think that we're going to see more of that as time goes on. However, it's not just the construction, it's the maintenance. One of the issues that's coming up with LEED certification is they find, yes, when they get certified after it's built, it has this level of energy efficiency. But like everything else, if you don't perform correct operation and maintenance on it, pretty soon it loses its ability to save energy. And so we have to be thinking about that issue. Now let's turn to transportation. why do we have so many cars in America? We have 260 million autos. I think, what is it, about 330 million people, and almost as many autos as we have people. You know, you go to suburban communities, and people have 3, 4, 5 cars, you know. All the teenagers have cars, and the adults have cars, and they don't share the cars, as, you know, and they're all driving. You know, you go, the daily life of many Americans involves hours a day in the automobile. You know, they're on the telephone in the automobile. Okay, if they could be, they'd be on the internet in the automobile. Many of them are, and it's making the automobile less safe. But the fundamental is that they're in traffic for hours on end. You know, you go to Los Angeles and you want to go out to dinner with your friends, you know, it's a 45-minute ride each way easily to go anywhere, okay? And that's become the way people live throughout America. It's really kind of astonishing when you think about it. And I think people are getting a little tired of it. At least some people are getting tired of it, which is accounting for people moving out of some subdivisions. And of course, the great danger here in New York City is when all these people from New Jersey show up and try to make right turn on red, you know. And there's these people that cross the street, they call them pedestrians here. I don't know if you've seen them. But in New Jersey, they apparently don't have them because these guys, you know, they're out there gunning for you. You know, and it's not just the right turn on red. It's this idea of yielding to a pedestrian. You know, that if somebody's in the crosswalk, the car is supposed to stop, not the people. It really seems almost alien to the culture. But in fact, we're seeing more and more people paying attention to these kinds of issues and thinking about the automobile. But what happened here, to be serious for a moment, is whenever people say, well, government can't spend money on infrastructure because it's anti-capitalist, who do you think built the roads? And what roads did they build, and why did they build them? The interstate highway system was built. Now, they were actually called the National Defense Highway System when Eisenhower proposed them. And the real reason was to have tanks be able to go from base to base and from one part of the country to the next. In fact, the real use of it, like most military infrastructure, ended up being to facilitate the development of the American suburbs. And then we discovered something. You know, you build a 2-lane interstate. It got, after a certain amount of time, the real estate in the outer areas gets filled up, and then the roads get filled up. So you build a 3-lane. It takes a little less time, they go a little further till it gets clogged up, and then you build a 4-lane. And transportation planners would tell you that there's no end to this, because what happens is, if I reduce the amount of time from my job to the place I'm living, then it makes the land a little further cheaper, so I go out there and I build, and then I build and I build. So in the Earth Institute, we have the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, exit 4, the Palisades Parkway. Land out there used to be pretty cheap for people to buy homes. The scientists all lived around there in relatively inexpensive homes. Now, the homes there are more expensive than some of them are within New York City. And part of the reason for that is that it got faster to commute up there by car. And people, you know, and that was all subsidized. All that transportation was subsidized. So with the exception of New York City, Americans travel more by auto than by any other means, and that makes them unique in the world. Americans are in their autos. And that is a problem for sustainability in the long run. Now, we will eventually go to less polluting cars, but the infrastructure that we've built, the sprawl pattern of development, we're kind of stuck with. And I think what you're going to see is more and more town-like settings out in the suburbs. You're going to see more and more, in a sense, that's how New York City developed. When you think about, you know, the part of Brooklyn I'm from, it builds up around a subway stop. I mean, it was basically the countryside. A subway stop gets built. Suddenly, right by the subway, you see higher density apartment buildings and a commercial strip. New York City is built that way. New York City is a collection of neighborhoods in that sense. And I think you're going to start seeing more and more of this in suburban areas, maybe with mass transit connections leading to them if the government decides to invest the money in it. One problem with sprawl development is that once it takes place, the land needed for subways becomes too expensive. And we actually see a graphic case study of this in Bogota, Colombia, where the sprawl took place first. I mean, Bogota, just like Los Angeles, developed out without mass transit with single-family homes and apartment buildings, but connected by the automobile. So what they did, which was kind of brilliant, is they built something called the red line bus system, a north-south and east-west dedicated bus line, which uses trolley-like train stations. So they have real train stations, and they'll attach 6 or 7 buses together. And what they do is they have timed traffic lights, and they ride on the surface. And it's the fastest way of getting around town. I can tell you I've had the experience of being in a taxi cab next to one of these things. We're stuck in gridlock, and the bus is zooming along. And they built it for $300 million, and the cost of building the subway there would have been $4 to $5 billion. So there are potential solutions. Personal transportation has to become more sustainable. We absolutely have to figure out a way to make a car that runs on something besides gasoline. And I think we're seeing the beginnings of that happening now. Another technical challenge is energy. Urban energy systems rely on centralized fossil fuel-based power plants and power transmission lines that are owned by government-regulated monopolies. The cities provide concentrations of customers, so a company like Con Edison can be profitable because there's so many customers along the line. So they invest in the infrastructure, and there's lots of revenue because lots of people are using the power there. Now, one possibility with the development of smart grids would be distributed power generation, where in fact people can generate power in their own homes, in their own apartments even, and when they're not using it, send it back to the grid. We don't have the technology. We have the technology to do it. It's not been widely spread yet, but that is clearly part of the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure of the future. Of course, as we learned earlier, with sea level rise, it'll all get ruined during the floods, but hopefully we'll figure out a way to deal with that too. But cities are built on energy. They require not just plentiful, but reliable energy. If you live in a developing country city and the power goes out, or the power goes out for certain hours of the day sometimes, or goes out for days on end, you can't really build an economy when you have that lack of reliability. And so you need reliable energy, but it has to be delivered at the lowest possible cost and with the least possible environmental impacts. Energy systems are often over-designed to prevent these failures, but those over-designs can be wasteful. So one of the places where information technology can in fact help us, and this is really where the smart grid comes in, is you can build a system with less redundancy and less waste if you have the kinds of control system that allows for you to not have to have essentially mechanical redundancy on redundancy on redundancy. One of the problems with that is that those kinds of systems can still be very vulnerable. I'm maybe being a little too abstract here, but if you think about last year, actually a few months ago, the Long Island Railroad switching station in Jamaica got hit by lightning, and it knocked out the facility, which was an old-style electrical switching facility. Fortunately, the people who worked there knew how to mechanically go out onto the tracks with pieces of equipment and move the tracks physically. Okay, so that was their redundancy. Now you can imagine a higher tech electronic system where we might forget how to do this physical switchover of the tracks. One of the fears that New Yorkers have in their subway is if we had a DC-style metro without conductors inside the trains that could actually run the train, who knows what might happen. And so there are those kinds of issues, but the technological fix of more elaborate computer controls and more sophisticated control systems with electronic rather than physical backups are possible. Another technological challenge is water and sewage treatment. Remember, we talked about these issues before, but sustainable sources of fresh water have to have the capacity to be resupplied with clean, fresh water. Geologic sources of water can't be relied on because they will run out. But one of the issues that I've written about recently is the issue of hydrofracking, which is, injecting liquids into the stone structure beneath beneath the ecosystems, essentially, to get at natural gas. The problem is, if in the process of doing that, you have an explosion, you have damage from the liquids that you're pumping in, you could contaminate your underground sources of water. And the water supply system that New York City relies on comes from an area that's also rich in natural gas. And so here we see the direct trade-off between cheap and even potentially low-carbon energy and our source of water supply. Now, the source of water supply, frankly, is more valuable because there's other ways of dealing with the energy issue, but water's water, and geography is geography. So we'll see. Unless natural ecosystems filter water supply, artificial water filtration system has to be constructed and maintained. They cost a lot of money, they use a lot of energy. And I think I talked about this in this class, but in New York City, if we didn't have the filtration avoidance agreement for the water that's on the west side of the Hudson, we would have to build a $6 billion filtration plant, which would cost us probably $500 million a year in interest payments and operation and maintenance to run. That's versus the $200 to $300 million a year now we pay the farmers and the other folks up by our water supply to use best management practices and to steadily buy the land surrounding the watershed to protect it. But all it would take is one Gulf of Mexico-style disaster as you're trying to mine for gas, and all that investment goes out the window, including the $5 billion water tunnel we've been building since 1970. So part of the question here is, can we be smart enough not to try to take risks that aren't sustainable? And we'll see whether New York State is smart enough over the next several years. Now, once water has been used, it becomes a waste product. When combined with stormwater, fresh water has to be treated and cleaned before it's returned to the waterways. Eventually, that's the same water you're going to drink. In other words, the hydrological system is a closed system. Okay? So you want to try to make sure that when you grab that sewage, you send it back into the water as much like water as you can and separate all the impurities and treat it in some other fashion. This is an energy-intensive process. So again, we see water and ecosystem protection and energy. All these systems are interconnecting at cities. And a sewage system that stops functioning, like a waste system, a garbage system that stops functioning, would create a public health emergency in a nanosecond. The first sewage treatment systems were built in part because of cholera. And in London, they discovered it was human waste that was causing it, which led to the development of modern sewage. We must have those kinds of systems functioning in our cities. So then we have this next technical challenge, which is solid and toxic waste management. Every person in the United States now generates 4.5 pounds of solid waste. We used to generate 2.68 pounds in 1960, but we've gone up a couple of pounds of garbage in the last 50 years. The 304 million people or so who live in the United States generate 1.3 billion pounds of waste each day. Waste per capita peaked at 4.65 pounds in 2000, is now going down. So this 4.5 number is actually lower than it was a decade ago. Now that actually gives me some hope that we may have peaked. And in fact, a lot of garbage, in 1960, almost all that 2.6 pounds was tossed into landfills. Now, about half of the garbage is recycled or is used in waste-to-energy plants to generate energy. And so we are recovering and burning more and more of our garbage. And again, so that technology curve is on the up. And that's also a hopeful sign. We're getting better at recycling and reusing materials. In 1960, 94% of the waste that we disposed of per capita ended up in landfills or non-energy producing incinerators. In 2008, 54%, or 2.4 pounds of every 4.5 pounds we disposed of, was dumped. So we're reducing the percentage of garbage we're dumping. Okay, this is a good thing. We have a long way to go. And of course, the other problem is we're creating more garbage per capita. So the finish line keeps moving. But this is an important place for us to understand the technology is changing. Closing the loop on waste disposal is an essential element of a sustainable system of material flow. What we want to do is everything we use in a city, we want to recycle or we want to use as an energy source in some fashion. That's really the long-term goal. There's an organization in California called Zero Waste that thinks that we could actually get down to having nothing thrown out in the end. I don't know if we can get that far, but we can get a lot closer to zero than 1.3 billion pounds a day. I think we can probably do that. The local economy and culture influences the content of waste and the best possible waste management options. And a city like New York has a different waste management problem than a city like Indianapolis. Indianapolis burns all of its garbage in a waste-to-energy plant. In New York City, we hope at some point we'll develop a marine transfer facility so it can at least ship the garbage out instead of driving it out of town in diesel trucks. But we need to work on the waste management part of our technical equation. Landfills are often the least expensive option for many places, but every landfill eventually leaks. I think eventually we're going to get better and better at this as resources become more expensive. The economy for recycling becomes that much more valuable. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on. I think some of that will just be a function of better technology, hopefully lower cost energy, and an ability to think through what we're doing. And also, frankly, the cost of landfilling in the northeast of the United States is getting higher and higher. And eventually we'll be like Japan, where over 70% of their garbage is burnt for energy. And I think we're going to see stuff like that happen in Europe. It's already happening, and certainly in the Northeast here. The toxicity of the waste stream and the presence of abandoned toxic waste sites are key technical challenges to urban sustainability. And here the issue of electronic waste is particularly important. And we have to figure out a way to reduce the toxicity of the waste stream through recycling, through reuse, and through separate sorting systems for garbage. I mean, the fact is, in this room, you see 3 garbage cans. 20 years from now, there'll be 6 in every room. You'll see more and more sorting, because if you can sort at the beginning, it really improves the technology going through. Although the other thing that might happen is we might end up with fewer garbage cans and better sorting machines centrally, but a lot of that will depend on the energy. Toxic substances can be difficult to recycle and can contaminate otherwise non-toxic and valuable substances in the waste stream. So part of the issue is trying to make sure that when we get rid of our garbage, that we do it in a way that doesn't contaminate the good garbage. In a sense, it's like a compost pile or an anaerobic digester, which is a mechanical version of that. If the stuff going into the wet garbage stream has toxics in it, then when we use the product of that anaerobic digester as fertilizer, it will have toxics in it and it won't be usable. And so we need to figure out ways of reducing the toxicity of our production processes. In other words, trying to reduce the amount of toxics in these electronics to begin with, but then to make sure that we separate it when we dispose of it. Now, there are a number of strategies now in place for dealing with toxic waste because we don't know how to technically detoxify waste. So the way we manage toxic waste now is we try to make sure people are not in the pathways of exposure, which is really what we did in the 80s in Superfund. Over 50 million people in America were in pathways of exposure in 1980 when Superfund passed. By 1990, virtually nobody was. It's a major environmental success story that nobody talks about. The other thing we do is we use water and filtration systems to gradually dilute a site and to move its toxics out. And the other thing we do is dig it up and segregate it. Now, none of those involve detoxifying, really. We don't really know how to take toxic substances and make them non-toxic, but someday we'll need to do that. Now let me talk a little bit about another technical challenge, which is air quality. Some of the sources of air pollution are local, but a lot of it comes from other places. You can do things locally to reduce the impact of air pollution, how you design your transportation systems, how you segregate residences, the amount of trees you plant. All of that can vary, and local conditions make a difference. We happen to be in a city that has a lot of wind that goes from west to east, and so when we don't have the kind of inversions here that you see in Los Angeles, which means we can actually take a heavier load of pollutants than some places can. Non-fossil fuels and energy conservation can reduce the environmental impact of electric power generation. And so there are things we can do technically to reduce air pollution, but air pollution remains a technical challenge of urbanization. Then there's the issues of quality of life, which I mentioned at the very beginning. Cities have to be attractive and exciting places to live. Now, we know we can build cities to be less environmentally destructive than other places, but we need to have amenities and employment that attract people. And that's part of sustainability in cities. Museums, university systems, nightclubs, good restaurants, all of those things are part of what makes an urban area attractive and therefore sustainable. Okay, there are financial challenges I should mention, which is to say that we're going to need a lot of new infrastructure to do some of these things. Electric car charging stations, smart grids, renewable energy. The problem in the United States, and certainly anybody watching the election last night wouldn't get this idea, but we're undertaxed. Now, I'm not running for Congress, so I can say that. But in fact, we're undertaxed and we don't save enough, and we're not building enough for the future in this country. And that's a very large problem. And a lot of the infrastructure we build, we borrow for, so we're basically saddling the next generation with many of the costs of that infrastructure. So we need to increase the savings rate. Now, fortunately, the Great Recession has done some of that. Our savings rate was actually below zero during the height of the boom of the Bush years, and is now gradually getting up to about 4%. Historically in America, the savings rate varied between 6 and 10%, and that's a society that's deferring gratification for the future. What we did during the 90s in particular, and during the first part of the 21st century, is we would take the wealth out of our homes, take out second mortgages, buy big screen TVs and extra cars. You know, I mean, literally, that's how America lived. That party's over. People aren't doing that anymore, and in place, they're putting away money for a rainy day. That creates the potential capital for investment in this infrastructure. So, but that still remains a financial challenge. The transition to a green economy is going to require massive investments in public infrastructure. Just as we built the interstate highway system, we're going to have to build a new system of energy generation and distribution. Where sustainability investments can save money, creative forms of municipal finance can transform the future savings into capital for immediate investments. In other words, if I know that by doing something I can save 20% of my energy costs, I can use those reductions in my monthly bills to finance that infrastructure. And we're seeing the beginnings of some of those techniques going on now, but that's not always feasible. And sometimes the people that have to build the infrastructure are not the same people who are going to benefit from those investments. Part of what's going on also is that some of these systems are getting more complicated and cost more. So water is probably the best example. The price of water used to be hidden in your property taxes. Now it's become a separate charge that you pay in addition to your property taxes. And the reason for that is that the cost of water has gone up. Filtration's gotten more expensive, sewage treatment's gotten more expensive, and transmission has gotten more expensive. And so we're paying more for it. Now, I think people can handle the idea. I remember when television was free, you just put up your antenna and it came to you, and now my television bill is over $100 a month, okay? And so water is working the same way. Urban amenities that promote sustainability are going to carry charges. The urban amenity of driving a car in Lower Manhattan will eventually require a separate charge. And I think other fees are coming because we're going to have to figure out ways of funding this infrastructure because we're just going to need to do it. Sustainable cities will require capital from a variety of sources. There'll be debt retired by increased taxes. There'll be savings that are generated. There'll be private investment. You see this with, I think it's Google is talking about getting into the wind transmission business in the Atlantic. But I will say this, if we keep starving our infrastructure investment in this country, then the future wealth of the country will be significantly impaired. We simply have to build for the future. Now, we've always done this in this country, but lately we stopped. I mean, in New York City, we stopped investing in the subway system for a decade, and the system almost collapsed. So we had to spend all of the 1980s rebuilding the subway system. In a sense, a lot of the critical infrastructure, the roads, the waterways, the electrical transmission lines in America need the same kind of replenishment that we applied to the city subway system during the 80s. This creates organizational and management challenges. Local government is where a lot of this action is going to be. And the corporate world is where a lot of these changes are going to take place. We need organizations to have the capacity to think routinely about how do we reduce material and energy resources? How do we reduce the amount of waste that we're generating? These have to become the standard operating procedures of the new management. And frankly, this is why I say over and over again that in the next decade, all effective management is going to have to be sustainability management. We simply have no choice but to add this to the equation. And just as financial accounting became part of how organizations were managed in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, information management comes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the physical dimensions of sustainability will be entering into routine management over the next 10, 20, and 30 years, because these parameters are going to become part of how a company develops a profitable edge and will be expected by investors and expected by taxpayers. You know, if you waste energy and water in your operation, people are going to wonder, what were you thinking of? Why are you? It will be just like wasting money on labor and equipment that you don't use. And I think that's going to become part of how we think about management in the future. Now, for this to happen, government has to play a role. The market alone is not going to do this. The market has never done these kinds of things alone. It's always required government. Government built the interstate highway systems, built the American farm system. It was deeply involved in the generation of power. In rural areas, the Tennessee Valley Authority transformed the middle of this country, or there wouldn't have been power in those places because it wasn't in anybody's financial interest to bring power to rural areas. All of that was government intervention. So government has to encourage, set boundaries, and educate. In the end, it's going to result in, I hope, a public policy environment that's more conducive to this, and entrepreneurship in the private sector that's focused on these sustainability issues. Now, anybody who watched the elections last night is thinking, boy, we're a long way from that. I'm actually writing something about that. I started it today because, in fact, most of the environmental plebiscites that were on the ballot yesterday passed. The most important one was in California, Proposition 23, which passed dramatically. Proposition 23 was an effort to repeal California's climate and energy laws. And one of the main constituencies for retaining that were the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley that are trying to move from the computer-based innovation they've been doing in the past to renewable energy and other kinds of sustainability investments. And they were out there pushing for this. And all over the United States, I think it was at least 80% of the environmental ballot issues passed. And people mistrust the institutions. They're scared about the economy. They're scared about the future. And they've clearly lost confidence in the Democrats and in the president. But they're not thinking that you can get around the constraints of the physical environment, and they're not willing to sacrifice the environment. So I think we're going to see more and more of this. but government has to get involved in it. And unfortunately, the mantra of the moment, the folks that just took over the House of Representatives keep referring to this as job-killing environmental jobs. That is complete and utter nonsense, okay? It's nonsense in economic terms. It's simply wrong. You know, the jobs of the future require these investments, you know, because, and if they don't invest in it here, you know, I guess we should all learn Mandarin, because in China they're figuring this out in a hurry. Maybe not as quickly as they think or we'd like to think, but believe me, America is not alone in the global economy. And if we don't take on these investments, we are going to be in trouble. Now, this idea that regulation is somehow anti-freedom we need to move away from that. You know, we regulated the car. You know, when Ralph Nader got started, he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. And he talked about the American automobile. And the American automobile, when he got started on this, had no seat belts, had no airbags, had no crash protection of any kind. And the automobile now is exponentially more safer than it was before he started. And nobody thinks that you destroy the automobile industry by regulating the safety of automobiles. And that's the point here. You know, in order for us to live safely and sustainably on this planet, we simply have to figure out a way to create a system of rules that allow us to have 10 billion people on this planet and have all of the high quality of life that we have today. You know, everybody has to be raised up to an income level to enjoy the things that you enjoy here and that I enjoy, and government has to be involved in that because it's not going to happen through the marketplace alone. So that's basically what I wanted to say about sustainable cities. The answer to the dilemma of sustainability is only going to be found in the world's cities. This idea that we're going to have to get back to the land in harmony with nature, you've heard me say it before, I'll say it again, there's too many of us and there's not enough planet for that. So the answer is we have to live in cities and reduce our carbon and ecological footprint, manage our waste, and learn how to live in these kinds of spaces. I believe we can do it, and hopefully we will.